Our next presentation today will be by one of our colleagues, and we're going to talk a little bit about the integration group, or subgroup, which really has a kind of tough job, and that it cuts across everything that we're doing. And so, General Les Lyles. Les?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, now you can. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Very, very happy to be here, and good afternoon, everybody. I guess I should note, did Steve leave already? Okay. I was just wondering if Steve left already. Okay. Steve, I just want to note, I've been talking about your water recovery system all afternoon. I noticed at our table we have these bottles of water with no labels on them. I hope it's from your system and not someplace else. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, this is a topic I think I'm going to be able to buy back some margin for our schedule this afternoon, and Mr. Chairman, at least try to get us a little bit back on schedule from all the great deliberations we've had to date. As our chairman said, this is ostensibly called the Integration Subcommittee, but in all honesty, it encompasses a lot of different things. The integration function is a very, very critical part of our deliberations, but it's something that we're going to have to really take in and really address as a result of all this other subcommittee activities after tomorrow. So that's still yet to come. What I want to focus on this afternoon are two different elements of this particular subcommittee, and that is the international perspective and interagency perspective. And to some extent, particularly the international, we had a chance to have some deliberations yesterday. The subcommittee consists of me, obviously, Dr. Sally Ride, Dr. Charlie Kennel, and Dr. Leroy Chow. And I also note, like Bo, I'm the only one who doesn't have doctor in front of my name. But anyway, we had a chance as part of Sally's deliberation on ISS and STS, shuttle extension and ISS extension opportunities and options, if you will, to discuss the international piece a little bit yesterday. This is perhaps a little bit fuller discussion today, hopefully to provide some illumination to you as to what our thought process has been in this particular area. I will tell you ahead of time, probably the obvious, if you will. This is a very qualitative assessment. You won't see any equations. You won't see a lot of graphs, if you will. You'll see one matrix, but a lot of qualitative assessment based on inputs from international partners, lots of other potential stakeholders in this particular topic. But again, I think it's helped us to figure out what are the kind of things that we, as a body, want to consider. Next chart. These are sort of the questions that we needed to address, the major questions, and it deals with the role of the international partners in our overall human systems, human spaceflight programs, role if the program is expanded or not expanded, what countries should be included in any expansive cooperative human spaceflight program, what are the roles that should be played by international partners, what issues, policies need to be addressed if we're going to make that a reality, and then from a perspective of other government agencies, what are their attitudes, their opinions, their concerns, their issues in the involvement of international partners in this particular endeavor. Next chart. To try to get to this, I mentioned this is a qualitative assessment with lots of detailed discussions, lots of interaction with lots of stakeholders. The most obvious, of course, talking to the NASA people themselves, both Bill Gerstenmaier and his people from the International Space Station perspective, the PA&E office and those involved in international activities within NASA headquarters and the NASA community. And we talked to just about every space agency around in the world. The one that's not listed on there by oversight, my fault here, that we did talk to first off is JAXA, the Japanese space agency. They were also part of our deliberations, but you see the kinds of individuals that we had a chance to engage with. You also see the perspective from other agencies, and particularly the Secretary of Defense Office, the DOD. We talked to the policy people there because of some major activities that they are currently involved in, doing a space posture review. And I'll explain a little bit later why that is important and where it fits in both the overall national equation on international perspective and what kind of feedback and comments we got from them. We talked to the Department of Defense National Security Space Office. That is a joint service and perhaps a joint agency, a organization within the Pentagon, reporting to the Secretary of Defense and ostensibly also reporting to the head of the NRO and the CIA, for that matter, and looking at intel aspects of national security space. And we talked to the White House in the form of the National Security Council and their staff and their deliberations also in this area. And once again, I'll share with you their comments and their perspectives on this important topic. Lots of dialogue with lots of experts. Dr. John Logson, who is a world-recognized expert in space programs, space policies, space issues, and particularly international, came out to talk to us during one of our visits. And we had a very extensive media search, if you will, literary search, particularly the most recent study from the National Research Council, which dealt with civil space, the topic of which was America's future in space, aligning our civil space programs to national needs. And there were obviously major inputs in that particular document dealing with international cooperation and dealing with our human spaceflight program. So lots of other dialogue. Those are the key stakeholders that we brought into the picture. Let me set the stage, if you will, by sort of doing a trend setting, if you will, of the tone, the environment that we're dealing with, both for our perspectives, but also our international partners. Next chart. If you review the overall picture about the space economy in the world, we're looking at something that's astounding when you look at the numbers, astonishing, $265 billion space economy. And that's been a steady growth since these figures have been tracked over the last several years. And it doesn't include national security space aspects, certainly for the Department of Defense. There are some 50 different space agencies around the world that have a stake, if you will, in space and space activities, all of whom are watching closely or dying for the opportunity to cooperate with and work with the United States, those who aren't already doing so. There's a U.S. sort of asymmetry, if you will, in terms of use of space assets, space capabilities, but also dependency. You'll see that in some numbers I will show you here subsequently, but you can also see it as pointed out in our National Research Council study and other studies along those lines, that we are heavily dependent on our space capabilities in this country to do almost everything. Almost everything we do every day involves space and space capabilities. Services, commercial services are growing. Commercial businesses are growing. That term photon-based services points out to the obvious about the communications and data and information like that we get from space. We depend on space to communicate and transmit capabilities and knowledge and information. This is really growing, and it's really obviously will grow some more in the future. The other growth areas are small but growing. There are obvious things that I think people could think of. The International Space Station is obviously largely through its development phase, or building phase, if you will. It's now to the point where people want to take advantage of its capabilities to get a return on their investment. And you'll hear that statement made in some of the comments that we received. And a growing number of countries and entities are looking beyond GEO, looking beyond LEO, with growing implications of cislunar space and their involvement in cislunar space, and lots of activities involved in robotic technologies, robotic efforts, particularly as to where it may play in terms of human spaceflight activities in the future. Next chart. This is sort of a 3 short paragraph or a few sentences from the National Research Council's report, America's Future in Space, and it points out a couple of significant major messages coming out of that entity. One deals with directing or aligning our civil space programs to look at broader contexts of how they can help solve major national needs, not only for us, but as it turns out, for partner nations and other nations around the world. The last one, I think, is the one that's probably very, very relevant to this, and that's working internationally to build a safer and more sustainable world was one of the other major messages, major underlying themes that was part of that particular study. Next chart. I touched upon the policy perspective, if you will. There is a United States National Space Policy Review directed by the President through a PSD, a Presidential Study Directive, PSD number 3. The National Security Council is responsible for exercising and executing this particular policy review. And these are some of the major principles. And I will point out that international cooperation, growing interest in international activities is a major part of the National Space Policy Review activities. And again, you'll hear some better perspectives, a little bit more perspectives in the comments, that feedback that we heard. Next chart. And this also is further documents from other studies as part of our literary search, if you will. Again, growing interest, growing support, growing relationship to the human spaceflight program in several different contexts. Next chart. Here is the one chart I'm going to show, matrix, if you will, and it again sort of puts a perspective on the involvement of other nations in space flight activity, again, not counting national security space. This is sort of an investment profile, and it categorizes it in terms of not only actual dollars in the budgets of the various countries, their share of the overall space investment activity that we're doing jointly through the International Space Station and other things like that, the percentage of their budgets in their particular countries that these dollars represent, and then the actual percentage of their gross domestic product. You see, obviously, NASA, the United States, leads. Russia, if you look at the magnitude of their dollars, it's certainly not as significant as ours, but in terms of its GDP and percent of its budget, it comes out fairly high, actually better than us, if you will, relative to the share of their national budget. And then you see the other countries listed here. The ones that are listed in red are, well, particularly India and China, South Korea, are partners that we don't currently have as partnership in the International Space Station. And then you see other countries that are represented here in those who are part of our current partnership and those we do other things with. I'll let you take just a quick glance at that. Okay, next chart. So with that, what does that all mean, and how did that factor into our deliberations and discussions about where interagency play in our human spaceflight programs, and what options do we might have in addressing that particular question? I want to give you sort of a quick summary from our subcommittee, and then I'm going to break down the comments and feedback that we got in the 4 different areas. How it relates to space exploration, how it relates to the International Space Station as it exists today, the current program, the program of record, how it relates to future potential utilization of an International Space Station, interagency comments, and then I'll wrap up with some issues before I get to my final chart of what our panel needs to deliberate upon over the course of our activities. Next chart. Here's the summary, and it was very obvious as we talked to the various stakeholders in this particular area, this particular arena. It's strong, almost unanimous support for continuing and expanding international cooperation in all aspects of the U.S. human spaceflight programs. What exists today, what we might do further with the International Space Station as option, if that's one of the things that we recommend and coming out of our study committee report, and what might pretend to take place in the overall human spaceflight activities, going to the moon, going to Mars, and potentially beyond. That's the overall summary. Next chart. Let me break that down, if you will, relative to specific comments. And let me just sort of highlight that some of the comments that we had with the space agencies and other nations were sensitive in nature. And by that I mean they were personal viewpoints, there were agency viewpoints, but in most cases, or in some cases I should say, they hadn't been formally discussed with their own governments. And so I will not give you a specific nation or a specific person attributed to some of these comments. So I've sort of generalized, if you will, and summarize exactly what the key messages were without attributing it to one individual nation or one individual himself or herself. In the area of overall space exploration, very strong message to us that there's growing political and media interest in space exploration in general, and that includes human spaceflight, not just what we have today with the International Space Station. One of the comments mentioned to us was that there was a tremendous outpouring of support and interest just a couple of weeks ago when one nation, one agency, announced its latest crop of astronauts to be part of the overall activities here within the International Space Station program. The individual commented that it was unprecedented in terms of the support from the media and the support and interest from the politicians in being part of that particular event. There are no detailed plans yet for exploration beyond the International Space Station, but that notwithstanding, every one of the organizations we talk to, every one of the individuals we talk to, detailed specific plans that they planned to put together, put in front of their leadership and politicians to get their formal blessing so it can be part of their overall spaceflight deliberations and plans for the future. International space agencies, the ones we talk to, obviously in some cases, are very, very enthusiastic about exploration. But a caution, both from them and from other independent assessments, that their governments may not be yet. And one of the key determinants in whether or not that yet becomes an issue is what happens with the United States and our plans for the International Space Station and our human spaceflight programs in the future. Sort of a caution. International roads and human spaceflight should take advantage of the expertise and the capabilities of our partner nations. This is something that we expected to hear, and we heard it in space from everybody we talked to. Very strong concern, in spite of how much people are getting out of the International Space Station program and the international cooperation today, very strong concern that for the space station and certainly for human spaceflight, the role of the international partners seems to be limited to some extent, and there's very strong concern that they want to take a stronger role, a larger role, and they want to take advantage of and give to us their expertise and their capabilities to help us in the ventures that we are all embarking upon. And probably the last major thing that I would highlight here in terms of overall space exploration feedback is that political will and symbolism are key elements needed to show the United States support for international cooperation in the human spaceflight program. Political will is sort of an obvious thing. They are waiting to see what we do relative to the International Space Station. What do we do with the gap, if that's something that we want to address? And then what do we finally do with the current plans and whether it might be modified for the human spaceflight program, the exploration vision we currently have in the United States. The symbolism comment was one that was not surprising, but it also was foot stomped by several of the people that we talked to. The symbolism of having a nation's astronauts named to be part of our program, and particularly as two of the respondents we talked to pointed out, it would really, really send a strong signal if one of their astronauts is named to be part of the first lunar party if we decide to go to the moon. The other symbolism is one in terms of policy and documentation. In the current exploration vision, when it was expressed and defined in 2004 and 2005, the talk about international cooperation is essentially one or two sentences. Now, that was still very significant coming from our president and our administration at the time and carrying over to the current administration, but it was very, very symbolic to our international partners that we didn't take it seriously. And so they are going to be looking very closely as to what the future is going to hold relative to international cooperation, as to whether or not we're more expansive relative to our support for that particular venture. Next chart. Key comments relative to the International Space Station specifically. The previous comments were about the overall area of space exploration. One that probably should not have been a surprise, that should not be a surprise to anybody. It is very, very important to the international partnerships that exist today for the ISS to continue beyond 2015. One of the obvious, again, comments mentioned to us by everybody we talked to, that the politicians, the leadership in those partner nations are now looking for their return on investment. We have spent roughly $70 billion on the International Space Station, $55 billion roughly from the United States, $15 billion roughly from our partner nations, and each one of those partner nations are now looking for the opportunity to get a return on the investment from that great laboratory, if you will, that we now have in space. So now that we've got it built, or just about completed building, and we have the opportunity to utilize it for science, for research, for development, for technology maturation, et cetera, that's where the return on investment point comes in for the international partners. Notwithstanding that concern, everybody sees the ISS as a proof of the value of international cooperation. It is more than just technical. It is nation building. I can't foot stomp how often we heard that statement mentioned from all the people that we engage. And they're watching us again to see how much commitment we make to the International Space Station beyond 2015. And if there is an opportunity to go beyond that, a commitment to full cooperation, as I sort of hinted before on the previous chart. Not just a marginal role, but an extensive role for the partners to play a significant part in. And failure of International Space Station partnership, and by failure they mean the failure to have the opportunity to get that return on investment or to be a full partner, could jeopardize further international cooperation in other areas, not just in manned spaceflight, not just in space endeavors at all, but other activities beyond that. And probably the last question that needs to be addressed in this area, particularly given the fact that there are others around the world who are interested, is that the current partners are all willing to accept other partners in this particular venture, as long as they come in on a level playing field. And by that, I mean terms of information sharing, willingness to be a full partner, and not holding anything back, if you will. Next chart. In terms of ISS utilization, this is relatively short because it's sort of an obvious extension of the previous comments. They are all looking, if one of the options is there, to extend the International Space Station to have the opportunity to fully utilize all of its capabilities. All the great laboratory potential that's there today in the International Space Station is going to be very germane to the opportunity for them to get a return on their investments. And something that was foot stomped to us that was also very, very much part of the National Research Council study that talked about other national priorities is that these other nations have an interest in other national priorities and using any opportunity to utilize the space station to help them, to help us, to help others around the world to address national priorities like energy concerns, climate change, environmental concerns, the sort of global common things, if you will, that need to be addressed. Next chart. Let me switch very quickly to interagency and a perspective from particularly DOD and the National Security Council and others that we talked to. It turns out that as part of the National Space Policy Review, and the National Space Posture Review, there is strong interest from a national security perspective to enhance cooperation in space with international partners. It is part of the major policy deliberations from both bodies. There was even some surprise and pleasure expressed in talking to the National Security Council staff that the national security arena is actually taking the lead, if you will, in actually addressing and supporting international cooperation. They see, the national security arena, see great value in having that cooperation going on in the civil world, actually to mirror what's now taking place in a more expansive sense, the cooperation going on internationally in the national security realm, the sort of mill-to-mill discussions that are going on. There are a lot of things that are happening, some of it, a lot of it in the classified realm I can't talk to, but it would be very, very pleasing and very surprising to everybody to know that that cooperation is growing and growing leaps and bounds from what it used to be. There was some concern expressed by particularly the National Security Council and also DOD that the cost and complexity of all of our space programs, whether you're talking national security space or civil space or human spaceflight programs, the costs and complexities are so large that there is value in having international cooperation and international participation to help us to address some of the complexities, to play a greater role in helping to solve some of the problems, but also potentially to share resources as we all try to address some common themes. There are some common issues amongst the partner nations. They address and impact national security programs. They impact civil space programs. They potentially impact human space programs in the future. It's space debris, space situational awareness, space protection are the obvious ones, and there's very, very strong interest and concern in having international participation as we address those kinds of things. Very, very interesting. Actually, I was very pleased coming from the National Security Council that the need for space exploration program and having a space exploration program that inspires the nation is very, very strong, at least coming from this current administration as expressed by the National Security Council. However, they also they realize that leadership commitment from the very, very top in this administration is going to be required to actually succeed in some of the things that are going on. Next chart. So let me just talk very quickly about comments, concerns, if you will, expressed from the various people we talk to, whether it's international partners, whether it's in the National Security Council, or whether it's Department of Defense. And the most obvious one, I foot stomp here 3 times because it's so severe, as everybody knows, is ITAR, ITAR, ITAR. We in our subcommittee and in our overall committee did not address ITAR concerns directly. We did, however, in part of our literature search, note that this topic has been hit very, very strongly in recent studies, major studies, the most recent one being another National Research Council study called Fortress America, and securing putting controls and how do we deal with controls on science and technology in a globalized world. That study was led by former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. They had some specific recommendations on how to deal with this particular problem, primarily in the area of not changing the controls, if you will, but improving the process so there's more balance, if you will, between the needs of science and technology protection and the needs for economic growth here in the United States. And I understand that this administration and this Congress now are taking their recommendations out of that study seriously. And all I can say from our subcommittee perspective is that we foot stomp and agree with what's already been said in that particular area. There's some industrial-based issues. Our committee, overall committee for this human spaceflight study, did not delve into this in great detail. We did look at industrial-based issues relative to solid rocket motors, and we've investigated that area and understand both what's real and perhaps what's not real in terms of concerns there. There is a expression of a need and concern about the need for a national launch strategy. I raised this question earlier today. This primarily comes out of the Department of Defense in their deliberations and their very strong concern, if you will, that there may be decisions made in the launch arena as part of our human spaceflight program that don't necessarily agree with all the concerns that the Department of Defense and the national security space people have. The most obvious concern there deals with human rating EELV. There's more data we are gathering on that particular topic from key people in talking to the leadership in the Pentagon and in the Secretary of Defense office. The sort of general tone is they support the potential of human rating EELVs as long as it doesn't jeopardize the opportunity to have sort of a white-tail approach on a production line. Their concern is an obvious one. It's launch vehicle availability and not having 2 costly production lines, if you will, one to support a human-rated EELV and then one to support an EELV for either national security, white world, or intel world launch capabilities. So dialogue still needs to be done in more respects on that. One of the comments made, not directly to me, but to one of our other committee members from General Bob Kaler, the head of the United States Space Command, was that we need a process to get all the stakeholders together, a formal process There is not a formal process that brings together the stakeholders from NASA, from the NRO, representing the Intel community, and from DoD, represented by the United States Air Force, to deliberate on these launch vehicle sort of questions that need to be addressed overall for our nation. Hence the interest in having a launch strategy review. I call it a broad area review when I raised the question earlier to our aerospace colleague. Bottom line, human rating is okay if there's a way we can work around what the mods are. So let me go to my last chart. What all of this means in terms of what our committee, our subcommittee, and also the overall committee has to consider. And particularly in addressing the international thing. There should be a question mark amongst each one of these because these are not final answers. They're not final conclusions. They're questions that we have to deliberate upon and we have to determine. As an example, should there be, as part of our recommendations coming out of this committee, should there be a mandate and a policy, if you will, that international cooperation is a foundation and an overlay for all scenarios we might have in human spaceflight, our human spaceflight programs. Not just those we've talked about so far with the International Space Station, but the broader scenario considerations we're going to get into tomorrow from Ed and others as part of his subcommittee's recommendations and activities. So should there be a policy that addresses that? And if so, how much should that policy extend in terms of mandating cooperation in an international realm? If there is a recommendation to extend the International Space Station beyond what its current plans are at 2015, should that extension be a venue to expand partnerships? Obviously, the partners have expressed their desire to us in that realm. And if we are able to expand the partnership, if we think that's one of the options we want to recommend, should the expansion include exploration research that related to the exploration program? Should it consider contributions to other national priorities, not just for us, but for other nations who are also interested in the same sort of global common concerns? And then probably more near term, if any of these things are potential realities or options, should we recommend sanctioned by the leadership, not just in NASA, but in the country, that we start the dialogue now with the international partners for consideration of these growing partnership opportunities at the regular discussions which take place for the current ISS partnership deliberations. So that sort of encapsulates what this subcommittee looked at in the terms of international and interagency considerations for our human spaceflight programs. Mr. Chairman, I will just close there and either take any questions from the rest of the committee members or sit down and give you some more margin. So.
Okay, Les, thanks so much. I'm sure we've got questions. Jeff, do you want to start?
I would be derelict if I let mention of ITAR pass without one more foot stomp. And I'm going to just focus on one specific aspect of it. The notion that in the name of our national security, we invite the best and the brightest technical minds from all over the world to come to this country so that we can give them a world-class technical education, so that we can tell them, please don't come work for our companies because we're afraid you might learn something, so that we make them go back to their own countries and don't let them come in and join their brains to ours, is the most mindlessly self-destructive policy I could conceive of if my goal was to damage the U.S. industrial base.
I guess I'll ask Bo to clarify what you said.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Jeff. As a matter of fact, I mentioned the National Research Council study, which touched upon this. This is such a major problem. At least I can think of at least 4 other major studies coming out of independent assessments. One done by the Congress or recommended by the Congress, looking at national security space, not international space, but looking at national security space. But we realized the limitations of having ITAR restrict so many different things. That particular, I said we because I was part of that study group. We also foot-stomped the ITAR issue along the same lines as the Brent Scowcroft study as one that needed redress, and that was a study that went to Congress. The National Research Council study, as you know, I chaired that for the National Research Council, so again, we foot-stomped that same very very important study. I mentioned Brent Scowcroft. There are enough messages out there, flashing lights, red lights, everything, that you would hope that somebody would get the message that we need to change. I keep hearing that there are changes underway, but the proof is in the pudding. We haven't seen it yet.
Chris?
Thank you. My question concerns your comment that your subcommittee looked at industrial-based issues, including solid rocket motor issues and what's real and what's not. Since this is our chance to deliberate as a committee, clearly one of the questions we need to think through as we think about Ares 1 and Ares 5 is the extent to which they are or are not critical for maintaining a national capability in segmented solid rocket motors. So I wonder if you could just say a bit more about that issue to help us deliberate.
Well, I'm hoping, Chris, I'm hoping that in Ed's discussions tomorrow and in our further deliberations, where we start talking about the key measures of merit, if you will, for our overall deliberations coming out of this committee, that industrial base is going to be one of those flags. I think we've all talked about that in fact-finding, but in our formal deliberations, we need to determine whether or not that's going to be one of the keys, because that needs to be held up against some of the options and scenarios that we are finally going to address. As you know, we've had lots of information presented to us, particularly in the solid rocket motor area, in terms of segmented rockets, P-band as a propellant formulation versus HTPB, big rockets, little rockets, impact on the industrial base for tactical rockets if something were to change in the current architecture. I think it's a major issue that we have to consider as part of our measures of merit overall for our final decisions.
Please, Charlie.
If I could, that we had with the international partners went something that to a person they almost, well, one of the major maintenance of an appropriate industrial base. And we saw one country that seemed to have a very design strategy to participate industrially in future exploration endeavors. So that was another aspect of the industrial base discussion that we had, was that just that we had to be delicate in understanding that they too had their industrial base issues. The other comment I'd like to make is to recount for the record something that I've said privately. After the vision for space exploration was announced, there was a great deal of uncertainty in the international community of partners, including the ISS partners. And so as a result of that uncertainty, they asked and arranged for AIAA symposium to be held in, of all places, Anchorage. Not, the results are therefore not very well known. But the international group got together with some of us in America, and they had two things to say. First, they're absolutely delighted that we got presidential endorsement of a strategy for future space, and that was very important. And they were upset that they hadn't been warned earlier in advance that this might happen. And in particular, the European Space Agency had had a strategy called Aurora that looks a bit like the VSE. And so the outcome of that discussion was what NASA eventually, to their credit, acted on was the creation, and forgive me if I don't remember the exact name, but an International Council or Exploration Working Group in which agency representatives get together on a regular basis and share on a no-commitments basis their plans, and so as to at least eliminate the no surprises issue. But from our experience in the earth sciences, such a forum also can serve later as confidence is built. Such a forum can begin to develop the horse trading and disclosure of future plans that leads to the schematic outlining of agreements that then can be taken forward formally. And so I would hope that as part of our discussion of the international situation, that we give a mention, in my personal view, a mention of that working group as a very constructive step that has already been taken.
Good point. Thank you.
Vote.
Excuse me. When I look at international cooperation, and two effects. One has to do with economics, and the other one has to do with instrument of international policy of this country. Economics is real simple. I was privileged to work on a joint venture that built sea launch, and we could have never come even close to building that system if we used it with Western means. We couldn't. We spent a little over $1 billion to build a whole launch system, home port, 2 vessels, and if we tried to use our own resources, would have been probably 3 or 4 times more or worse. So, but you have to find a match. You have to find people that have value that is complementary to your own. And this goes a little bit in crossways with the other objective, which is foreign policy. Sometimes you bring partners to the table who maybe don't have a perfect match in terms of economics, but they have a good political fit. So it's a tricky thing, but if you work it, and I think can benefit both, can elevate NASA profile and relevance because you become an instrument of foreign policy, and it also can work to benefit in economic sense because you can get partners who bring products that you couldn't build or buy for the same number of dollars in America. So, I love your idea of expansion of international cooperation to be one of our thrusts in all the scenarios we work on. Planet has gotten smaller. It was a little bit bigger when I worked on sea launch. It's smaller now. It's time.
I just want to say a few words generically about industrial base issues to share views with the rest of the committee by way of deliberation. And you have to draw. Industrial base is a flag under which an awful lot of less than noble things can gather. There is a crucial difference between preserving the fundamental capability that we as a nation have to do certain things. That's a very important value. And saying that whenever you stop buying anything, the nation has been irreparably damaged. I draw the analogy, as some of you have heard me do. As a result of national policy decisions, we have irreparably lost our ability to purchase 1964 Corvettes, and we will never get it back. But that's, but so what? At some point you move on. So we got to be very careful when we look at these things to distinguish between those two kinds of industrial base issues because they're not of equal importance.
I guess it's my turn. I've got several questions for you, Les, if I may. The first one is a fairly specific one. Is it the recommendation of your subcommittee that international partnerships include activity that's on the critical path for missions?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it is. It is.
And
at least open the opportunity for considering it.
Let's see, I was with you till the end there. You get to be a lawyer, not a general. How about giving me an order?
Let me be more specific. I think the committee agrees that we need to change the policy. We would recommend changing the policy so it's not restricted that possibility can't even be talked about, if you will. At least open the aperture so you can openly consider having international partners participate if there's a capability there on the critical path.
Okay,
right now, the dialogue can't even take place.
Got it. Thank you. And the way that the general phrased that is the rest of the group. Is there anyone in the group that would want to disagree with that, take a different position? Seeing none, I gather that we're all with you on that. My second question is In one of your charts, it said that the international community, or some part of it, that was supporting continuing ISS felt that it should be its objectives should be expanded to include exploration. And I wondered whether they just meant effects of zero-G on astronauts' long-term exposure, or whether they really meant exploration.
I probably should have put that in capital letters as part of the exploration program. It's to include goals. By the way, this is similar to one of the things we deliberated upon yesterday from Dr. Ride, from Sally Ride and Charlie and Leroy, and that's use the ISS to also investigate technologies or research and development related to the exploration vision, exploration program, as opposed to just those laboratory capabilities that exist on the ISS today. And that's the same sort of message we heard from several of our partners, that possibility becomes open if the ISS is extended.
Terrific, thank you. Let's see, I've got two more questions, Les, if I may. One is the proposal we should have a national launch strategy and some mechanism to create it and maintain it, which certainly makes an awful lot of common sense. You and I talked a little bit about this, but I guess I'd kind of like to get it out discussion here. Given where we are today as a nation in terms of the Constellation program, if we open that up to a national security strategy and so on at this point in time, maybe a good thing to do, I don't know, but it seems like it might add a couple of years.
And I don't think that's the objective of any of the people, the stakeholders that we talk to, whether it's DOD or broader national security, or certainly within NASA. I think the objective was really just to allow a process by which any other agencies' equities are at least considered. And that does take place. I'd be very, very naive if I didn't say that doesn't take place today, but it's more of an informal ad hoc basis. And there's a need for a sort of broader formal basis that doesn't become a bureaucracy to allow that sort of dialogue to take place. Sort of related comment here is one that came out of any of the studies I just previously mentioned earlier, the National Security Space Study I talked about, the National Research Council study, and we've talked about it here, the need for a National Space Council within the highest area of our land, within the White House, I think is the recommendation, to allow all the stakeholders who are involved in space to get together on a formal basis to coordinate, integrate, compare, better leverage each other's equities, requirements, capabilities, resources. That does not take place anymore. We no longer have a National Space Council. And the foot stomp, I testified to Congress on this a couple weeks ago, the foot stomp is not to create a bureaucracy that makes a mother may I that impedes everybody's progress, but to have a formal basis for a dialogue and perhaps even rebuttal for people to consider, but not to slow anything up.
Thank you for clarifying that. And my last question relates to some newspaper articles I read while I was traveling during the 40th anniversary celebration outside the country. And several of the articles I saw talked about the U.S. going back to the moon and the possibility that other countries might get involved with it. And several of the articles I saw, not all, played the why go back to the moon, we've been to the moon, we've seen the moon, that's ho-hum, who cares? And they said, now, if you were to go to Mars, that'd really be exciting and something worth doing. But they said in so many words that the U.S., the President of the United States himself said 20 years ago that we were going to go to Mars. Another president said it 8 years ago, I think it was, or whatever, and that we were going to go to Mars. And now we're saying that we'll go to the moon, and if we have money, we'll eventually go to Mars. Nobody knows when. And so given such an unexciting program, why would anyone want to get involved in it, including us, was what they said.
I'm not sure who wrote those articles. To me, it's somebody who's uninformed of how exciting and challenging all of these ventures are, even today, not going to the moon. It's just the fact of things, the great things we do at the International Space Station. Let me just give you my comment from the perspective of our subcommittee, and that's to share, I think, the general consensus we heard from the international partners. Now, I ask Leroy and Charlie if they disagree or have any other thing they want to add. I think to a nation, if you will, everybody saw that going back to the moon was an important step. One, to mature the technologies and to get back on the step, if I can use that terminology, get back on the step of exploration beyond LEO, which is something we obviously have not done in a manned presence in, well, since 1973, was that Apollo 17, 74, since Apollo 17. They saw the value of that. They also saw the value of using the moon as a way to mature those technologies, those capabilities, those operations that we would need to go to Mars. And I think I heard pretty much of consensus that going to Mars, while all the nations haven't said that's something they want to do, certainly from a formal standpoint, I think the space agencies all seem to have support for human spaceflight beyond LEO and beyond lunar. But they see that that's still important. Going to the moon is a critical sort of waypoint to really get back to the capabilities to make going to the Mars a reality. Leroy and Charlie?
Yeah, I'd just like to tell you a little bit, take a few minutes just to talk to you about my personal experience with international cooperation. I have to admit that, you know, in the early to mid-'90s when we started up with the former Soviet Union, I was not a big fan of cooperating, and I thought, well, what are we going to get out of this? And it really wasn't until I started going over there and really till I started training for my ISS mission that I really got an in-depth look of what they were doing and got a bigger picture of what we were doing as a country. And I have to say, my views turned 180 degrees around. I became a big supporter of international cooperation. It gave me a greater understanding of what the other folks were doing and how everyone fit together, and the bigger picture beyond just the space program of the good of international cooperation. Since that time, I've visited the space programs of various countries, including China, and I've been very impressed, and I'm able now to, from the vantage point, all the points that Les talked about in his briefing, I can see the potential of where this can go, not only in the space program, but for the country and the world as a whole.
Thank you, Leroy.
Yeah,
Charlie?
I'd just like to, one comment. It seems to me that everybody, because of the prominence of the vision to space exploration, everybody sees that the main line to Mars at present runs through the moon. On the other hand, in the context of a much broader international collaboration in the future, there are other exploration objectives, whether it is to Lagrangian points or lunar orbit or Phobos orbit or landing. You can see other rich objectives in the exploration of the solar system that the various nations of the world may wish to engage in, let's say, over the next 50 years, that could be part of enriching the dialogue of international collaboration in the exploration arena. And I think it's fair to say that we've thought more about it than any of our partners, and that some sort of international dialogue, a deeper dialogue on the goals and objectives would be very useful. And I think there have been a recent statement by the International Working Group to that end, but deeper dialogue, I think, would be very useful.
Please, Chris?
Les, in your comments, you about the international partners, you talked about how the international agencies are enthusiastic about exploration. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what you heard with respect to any desire to participate in planning. Does that extend to the point where those agencies would like to be involved in planning something like the new architecture? And do you think there's a practical route to that end, or is it too late with respect to the U.S. program?
Chris, I don't know if it's too late, but I think there's a recognition that we are where we are, if you will, and most of the planning, or a lot of it, has already taken place. And certainly they would like to now, if there's an opportunity for ISS extension or greater involvement in international partnership, they'd like to be included at the table. for future planning. They certainly don't want to disrupt things, if you will, as to where they currently are. But I think, again, it was a sort of unanimous view that they want to be a full partner. I think that's the key word in all the activities, and planning is part of that.
So would you say that the committee should or should not have a recommendation to the White House that in the coming months, because that's the time scale we're talking about, even less than that really, that more consultation be done at some level with international partners?
I would say yes, and perhaps, not perhaps, I know I was probably inarticulate in crafting my last bullet on the last chart. It talked about getting their involvement in the upcoming discussions on international partnerships. It was really meant to say exactly what you talked about. There's a short-term opportunity to now engage with them and to get them involved, if that's one of the things we agree is a key recommendation coming out of this.
Would there be
Yes,
anybody on the panel who would disagree with that recommendation? Les, you made another recommendation that had to do with creating a more formal mechanism within our government to coordinate space vehicle needs, I suppose in particular. And I assume you offer that as kind of a formal recommendation to your group?
I do. I hesitated, and actually we've only touched on it peripherally during our subcommittee, but I hesitated in making that a formal recommendation because it's one that's slightly outside of our overall charter, but it's so germane to succeeding in various things. I would have to say yes, Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that to the overall committee.
Yeah, I think that's within our charter, within reason. Does anybody have no problems? Okay, that's fine. Wanda, did you have something you want to say?
I was just going to speak up in support of that recommendation. I think it would be valuable, given the limited resources, that if we as a government could get organized and speak, in a unified voice as what's good for the nation, that would be good. So even if it was viewed as outside of our charter, I think it would be something that we should offer up.
Okay, Les, anything else from you?
No, sir. I thought I was going to get you back on schedule, but I took about 15 minutes of your margin, so I apologize for that.
We helped you. Incidentally, you don't take 15 minutes of a negative margin. It doesn't work that way.
Touche.
Okay, thank you, Les. Does anybody on the panel have anything else you'd like to offer today? Tomorrow, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just real quick. This ITER is, I know that there are some good reasons for it, but, Les had it 3 times in his chart, ITER. If you are at NASA, maybe you have some special treatment, but let me tell you, if you're in industry, it's so difficult. And, I'll give you some quick example. We bring some Russian flight hardware to Long Beach. Somebody declared that since these rockets, they're not ICBMs, they're rockets, they are on U.S. soil, we can't have Russian or Ukrainians have access to them. We scramble, they have live pyrotechnics, they're pressurized, and we were like in this awful situation trying to figure out how to get these guys who know this stuff come and take care of their flight hardware. And that shows you how extreme case of what ITER can do to a private business. So I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if I haven't really, I'm just reacting to what Les had, but if there is some recommendation we could make, when we talk about international cooperation, somebody has to look at our ITER rules, or it's going to be, otherwise it will continue to be an incredible drag.
Yeah, we probably should make a recommendation along those lines. You don't want to get me going on ITAR, but I recently chaired a committee for the Department of Commerce on the subject, and it's an amazing thing that there's one related provision having to do with what's called deemed exports. That if you're a professor in this country, really, Chris, you could explain this better than I, but if you have a foreign national in your classroom and say something to that individual that's covered by ITAR, you may have committed a crime. And when you see the list of things that are covered with ITAR, by ITAR, last time I checked, they included shotguns, handcuffs, and something called the horses by sea are in this long list of ITAR. covers. This was written, of course, during the height of the Cold War, with technology of the time, without international technologies, without international students. It wasn't a global world. It just is not relevant, but it sure is an impediment. End of speech. Back to more serious things. Maybe not more serious, but more appropriate.